Welcome to Barriers to Execution, a problem-solving toolkit. I'm Tom Perry. I'm an Agile transformation consultant and coach here in the Seattle area. I'm also the author of the little Book of Impediments, and I founded the Agile Management Conference here in the Northwest, which we run every year. And I'd like to take you through a few different topics on the subject of barriers to execution. First, we'll discuss understanding the barriers, because what's behind the barriers oftentimes is very significant. Then we'll talk about how we overcome those barriers. And then I'll share some connections and next steps and a little bit of personal information about how I handle these things. And then finally, we'll wrap up with a conclusion and a gift. So, starting with understanding the barriers, I think this picture captures well the idea that barriers can be both visible and cultural and hidden. And that's often the case when it comes to really significant barriers to execution. Oftentimes, cultural barriers can be modeled using this model here, the Schneider culture model. This came from Israel Gatt. He was the person who introduced this to me many years ago. And you'll see there are 4 different quadrants here, and we're working along 2 different axes. One is the personal to impersonal axis, or personal to more corporate axis. And then you have possibility versus actuality or reality. And loosely speaking, in this model, you have 4 different fundamental types of culture, starting with the control culture in the upper right-hand corner, which is reflected by an organization that's oriented around power, predictability, and process. And, you know, the term you might hear is we succeed by getting and or keeping in control. The competence model is much different. It's much more possibility oriented, still on the more corporate axis. And this is an organization that's oriented around achievement, meritocracy, craftsmanship. And oftentimes you'll hear that in terms like, we succeed by being the best. Then you have the cultivation model. And in a cultivation-oriented culture, it's much more focused on self-actualization, purpose and faith and dedication. So you'll typically see a cultivation culture in organizations like churches, for example, religious organizations. And those organizations, in those organizations, you might hear people say things like, we succeed by growing people who fulfill our vision. And finally, there's the collaboration culture. It's characterized by affiliation, partnership, and teamwork. And if you're in an organization like this, typically you might hear it self-described as, we succeed by working together. So these organizations, I think these cultures are important to understand as our starting points for understanding where barriers come from, because each of these groups will see barriers differently. The control organization will see barriers where there is anything that gets in the way of power or predictability or process. Well, that's going to be very, very different from the cultivation organization. A cultivation culture is not going to see anything that blocks power as a barrier. They're not going to see the same things as barriers. They're going to look at something that gets in the way of their dedication, their purpose, their faith. Anything that gets in the way of that is going to be an obstacle to them, but it wouldn't be perceived as such by the control culture. So the first thing you need to do when you're understanding barriers is understand the culture you're in, because that determines what you perceive as being a barrier or not. So this is a very, very important starting point for where we even identify barriers coming from. And that leads us to conceptual barriers. So oftentimes you'll see people have very mechanistic corporate models. I've heard people actually refer to people working in software as working on an assembly line where we just pump out widgets. Well, In reality, in software, there aren't many assembly lines. In fact, it's a lot of design and development work where you're doing unique work and you're experimenting, and it's utterly unlike an assembly line. But that mechanistic corporate model locks us into a certain way of thinking, and it shapes the way we think about things that are getting in our way. Strategic models, project based funding, for example, that also, if you're using a project based funding model, confines or constrains the way you're thinking about a problem and limits you in what you think your options are. It creates barriers simply by having that model of thinking, that model of organizing the funding for your organization. If you switch to a product-based model, a lot of those barriers go away. Of course, you get some different constraints with that. And then there's the performance-based models like stack ranking, which has a whole bunch of issues, which I won't go into. But basically, that also limits your thinking and creates all sorts of barriers to execution and performance that don't necessarily have to be there and are simply an artifact of the mental model used to organize people in the organization. And then there's compensation. And I'm talking about things like individual versus team compensation, which again, depending on which way you go, will create different barriers to the kind of execution you're trying to achieve. And there are structural barriers. Those are always there. And those are at least the easiest to find. Up to this point, everything I've discussed has been invisible barriers, cultural barriers, mental models, those sorts of things are invisible. And those are oftentimes the most challenging barriers to overcome. The ones you can see often are at least easy to identify. And I'm thinking of things like silos, any kind of physical separation between groups where you may have half the team in Taipei and the other half in Russia, or part of your group in New York and part in Los Angeles. You have technical gaps, different kinds of technologies being used, old technologies being used, legacy technology being used, scheduling conference rooms. I know some organizations, especially organizations that are highly, highly meeting centric, they run into all sorts of barriers to execution in simply finding someplace to talk to one another. And component-based teams also create their own barriers, and radically dispersed teams that are all over the country. And then there are process barriers, and these are things like phase gates, project-based funding, which I've already mentioned. Hyper-specialization of roles creates barriers. If you create, the more roles you create, the more handoffs you create. The more handoffs you have, the more things slow down, the more documentation and other things you need to support it all. So change control also creates barriers. Too many meetings, review boards, and compliance being some more areas where the process itself is creating a barrier to execution. So that's the fundamentals, the underlying structure of the organization itself and how it can create barriers. The way we think, the culture we create, the processes we use, all of those things are creating barriers for us. So how do we overcome those barriers? Well, let's take a look at that. As we look at overcoming barriers, there are one thing that I think we really have to approach is the idea of establishing barriers as first-class citizens, making them a top priority. It's all too easy to give barriers to execution lip service. And I've seen executives make this mistake time and time again, where it comes up in the employee satisfaction survey that there are too many things keeping people from being able to do their job. So it comes up at the annual meeting and the executives make a big deal out of it, but they don't fund it. They don't prioritize it. They're still focused on the business at hand, the efficiency part of the equation, and they're doing nothing effectively to eliminate the barriers. So if we're going to eliminate barriers, my contention is that we must make them first-class citizens. That means we need to fund them, and we need to fund them equally to our largest investments, because if we're going to make them a priority, we're going to have to deal with them in terms of cost, and the costs of significant barriers are usually much, much more than people initially expect. So give them priority funding, give everyone spending authority to remove the barriers. There was a company I worked at many years ago where everyone in the company had a credit card, and that credit card had a $2,000 balance. You got it on day one of employment, and the deal was you could use that credit card anytime you encountered any sort of barrier to resolve it. And that was a very powerful way of empowering the teams, the people, to actually execute on these barriers. So, um, so giving them the spending authority, giving everyone the ability to break the barriers so that it doesn't have to go up the food chain and be evaluated along the way is very important. And they have to be your top priority. They're not a nice to have. You have to be absolutely relentless when going after these things. And the people that are successful in doing that are the ones that are able to successfully eliminate barriers to execution. You also have to understand the problem really, really deeply, really well. So they can be slippery and ambiguous. Oftentimes, when barriers are discussed, people will bring what they think are problems to the fore that may or may not actually represent the underlying problem. And so, doing some root cause analysis can help you from chasing down sort of phantom barriers that are sort of one person's opinion about what the problem is. It's very important that you understand the problem deeply so that you don't go chasing ghosts. And go and see, go to the Gemba, always validate your understanding and test your assumptions so that you have a deep appreciation for what the problem truly is before you go and you try and solve it. And lastly, make the barriers visible. So in every single all hands meeting, start the meeting with a conversation about the barriers that you've overcome. Make it the first item on the agenda. You can do things like creating a most wanted board, which I worked at a company where the executives put up this most wanted board, and for every barrier that went up there, they had a reward for what they were hoping they would, they would deliver if people resolve the barrier. And you can create an impediments log. That's pretty fundamental. And track progress with things like an impediment snake. All of that is to say, make the barriers to execution in your organization as visible as possible. Because as I pointed out earlier, many barriers are invisible. So we have to go out of our way to highlight them and make them as visible as possible. So here, what I'd like to do is draw a few connections and hopefully give you an example of how this might work for you and how it works in my life. And so I want to talk about some personal barriers to execution. With the advent of the pandemic and the COVID virus, I've got the whole family at home. I've got the kids in from school. And so all of a sudden, my day is filled with activities like coordinating the family. We're in isolation. So all of us are suffering as we're trying to make connections and keep in touch with friends and family. And business is uncertain right now. I've probably never felt busier or less productive. So it's a tough time right now. And these are all barriers to me and my family's execution. Along those lines, we tried a few things. Tried coordinating the family by introducing a Kanban board and a daily stand-up. The idea there was to get the family involved and engaged in coordinating the activities in the household so that I didn't have to be in a command and control position where I was telling everyone what to do. And by and large, that worked out very well. With regard to isolation, we've used Zoom meetings, Hangouts, basically multiple communication channels to have casual conversations with friends, colleagues, family, and stay in touch. And then with regard to focus, I use things like the circles of influence and the Eisenhower matrix, which is the important and urgent versus the not important and not urgent, to prioritize my work and give myself some idea of the things that seem most important and most urgent now. And using the combination of these two tools, I've been able to narrow down the scope of things that I'm focused on to the stuff that seems most important right now. So it's using some of those prioritization tools to help me keep focused on what's most important with each day. So I'd like to wrap up, and first by attending this webinar, I'm sending everyone a free copy of the little Book of Impediments. You'll get a PDF version in the mail. It's just my way of saying thank you. Hopefully it'll provide you some utility in your own efforts to remove barriers to execution in your own organizations. We offer at Thomas Perry LLC a lot of upcoming classes and services, including custom training, SAFE certification, and other training and executive coaching and management consulting. So please check out the website. It's thomasperryllc.com, and you can see upcoming events, upcoming trainings. You can book your trainings online or give me a call and I'll be happy to discuss it further with you. So thank you again. I really appreciate your time. It's been great chatting about these issues, and I look forward to our next webinar. Thank you very much.